opponent on hand so that you can check up on what he's saying immediately, rather than to pursue him and to try to catch up with the positions which he may have represented, some of which are perhaps correct and some slightly in error. The one issue which I like to talk to on campus, of course, is my attendance record, since I assume that most students are against perfect attendance. But I do find some who have been disturbed by it on other campuses, and since I'm going to talk to you, and you're going to have a question period, of course, I'm going to talk to you really about somewhat more serious issues, I think, than some that have been emphasized thus far in the campaign. To put your minds at ease, the general attendance record in the United States Senate runs about 85%. I think that's a little bit high. We ought not to be there quite that often. But in any case, that's about the average for all members of the Senate, and my attendance record is standard. My record is about 85%. Some years I'm 84, sometimes 85. I think I was 87 this year. So I hope you'll keep that in mind as this great issue makes its rounds here in the state. And if you're hard-pressed and really want to defend me, you could point out that Senator Goldwater's record has been running at about 70%, which is, on the basis of count, twice as bad as mine. The only difference is that no one in the Senate particularly misses him when he's gone. And so a different issue. This particular Congress, which has just ended, the 88th Congress, is one which has been criticized along the way for being slow and tardy and for taking a long time to take action. But now that it has finished its two sessions, one last year, which went on until Christmas time, and the session of this year, which lasted until about 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, is being reevaluated by commentators and by columnists who are kind of short-range historians as to what it actually did accomplish. And most of the judgments now are turning out to be rather favorable. And I think this is a proper judgment. It doesn't excuse us really in some cases from being in session too long. It doesn't necessarily justify the filibuster as a part of the proceedings of the Senate. The fact is that we did act in this session of Congress in three significant areas which received a great deal of attention. One of these, the action on civil rights, which involved really two things. One, a kind of catching up on the part of America and on the part of the Congress itself with reference to basic rights which had been declared for at least 190 years ago and to which lip service had been given, which have been a matter of concern, of course, throughout the history of our country. But finally, the Congress itself, speaking really in the name of the people of this nation, took the positive and formal action of passing a comprehensive legislative program designed to ensure that these rights not only be guaranteed and not only declared for, but that they be realized in fact. Not just a matter of catching up, but also a projection, really, of America into the future with reference to the issue of equality and of the rights of all people. And I think the action on the Civil Rights Bill has significance, of course, primarily with reference to our own people and our own society, but also I think it has great bearing upon our position, either as a leader of the free world, as we're so ready to say, although there's some question as to the extent of our leadership, but at least as an example to the rest of the world, that we not only declare for these things, but we believe that formal action must be taken to secure them. And it's my judgment that if we progress, as I hope we shall in this country, that our leadership in the councils involving the African people, involving some of the Asiatic peoples, and involving some of the peoples of Latin America will become much more positive and much more effective. It took us a long time in the United States Senate to debate and to discuss the issue, but the filibuster was different from past filibusters in that the arguments made by the Southerners were always pertinent to the point. You might disagree as to their interpretation of history, or their interpretation of the Constitution, or their reading of the traditions of America. but you had to credit them with what at least appeared to be sincerity, and no one really has the right to go beyond the appearances of men in public debate or in the statement of their position. The second area of significant action taken by this Congress was that taken by the Senate in answer to the President's response that we ratify a test ban treaty. This was more a projection, I suppose, of America into the future, but it demonstrated to the rest of the world that this nation, possessing the power and the control over a great destructive weapon, something which the mind of man had developed in nuclear power, but nonetheless prepared to make a moral commitment with reference to how we might use or how we might develop that power. Here again, the Congress could not act on its own. This was not just a kind of rationalized conclusion that we could come to after hearing the evidence, but it involved really a projection of the spirit of America. To take an action of this kind is a most difficult one for a member of the Senate who's called upon in a case of this kind to represent what he believes to be the moral attitudes of his people. But in any case, the action in the Senate was a strong action, and I believe that it did reflect the moral commitment of the people of this country. It did express their willingness to take some chances, to take some risk, really, in the hope that nuclear power might be kept under control, and to the extent that it appeared to be getting out of control, might be restrained. And the third area of action, somewhat less dramatic and I suppose more difficult to present in moral terms or in idealistic terms, but nonetheless I think most important, to do with the whole complex of legislative actions relating to the American economy, not just to the economy, but to the operation of that economy as a device for meeting the needs of the people of our country. The action which received most attention was, of course, the tax cut bill. This primarily reported in quantitative terms. Columnists could say that it was the largest tax cut in the history of the country. Not that that proved anything particularly, because we're operating at a time when the economy, the gross national product, is higher than it's ever been before, and the federal budget is higher than it's ever been before, so that this was really a relative kind of measure. But the significant thing about the tax cut of last year was this, that it was not presented and not proposed and not defended on the traditional lines. Ordinarily, we have accepted that a tax cut is in order when we're in a recession or when we're in a depression, or the tax cut is in order when there's a surplus in the federal treasury. Well, last year and the year before, we were not in a recession or we were not in a depression, but the economy was operating at a higher level than it had ever operated at before. Under these circumstances, to propose a tax cut would have been contrary at least to tradition and to the views of some who are called classical economists. Classical economists, really a classicist of any kind now, is really someone who expressed his judgments in the past. The second argument or condition which would ordinarily have justified a tax cut, namely a surplus in the federal treasury, was not present, but there was a deficit. So these two conditions, which in the past would have argued against a tax cut, did exist. Nonetheless, it was reasoned and argued that we ought to cut taxes, and that if we did, even though the federal deficit might increase, even though we had no recession or no depression, that the economy of the United States could be moved by virtue of that action from a high level of production to an even higher level of production without the intervention of a recession or of a depression. And I said to Walter Heller at the time we were considering it, and I was supporting him, that if this failed, that there'd be a lot of vacant chairs of economics around the country. Well, it does appear as though the economists were right, that their reasoned judgment, and in this case the theory of economics, has been proved in practice. I don't mean to say that other theories have not been proved in practice, but this was the most comprehensive test, I think. And it was a test which was undertaken in the face of severe criticism and expressed doubts on the part of many. It's not just the tax cut, but other actions taken by the business and financial community of America which do bear upon what is happening. But I think we have demonstrated that the economy of this country can continue to grow, can continue to produce more and more goods to meet the needs of our own people and to help us meet our commitments around the world without recessions and without depression. Certainly we have answered the Marxist criticism that we could not be productive without the exploitation of labor and without the class struggle, without the artificial stimulation of war, although of course defense expenditures are still a very important force in the operation of our economy. What we're called upon now to demonstrate is that we have the answer to the other major criticism which has been directed at our economic system by the Marxists and by others, namely that whereas we can be highly productive, we cannot solve the problems of distribution. The problem of working it out so that everyone who is able to work and willing to work can establish a claim for himself and for those who depend upon him against the total goods and services that are produced in that society. We have not yet fully answered and responded to this challenge. We have the problems of unemployment. We have the problem of poverty in many sections of the country. Some of it is residual poverty left over from the failures of the past, from the Depression, from the fact that we have had in some areas of the country a kind of continuous poverty in the rural areas. Some of it is poverty which results from our not having been able to adjust to the rapid urbanization of our society. And some of it is poverty which is the result of our not having been able again to adjust to the changes in industry, automation and the increase in mobility, the movement of people from one part of the country to another, the closing down of industries and the opening up of new industries, this whole problem of transition and of response to change. Well, we have recognized these problems and have responded perhaps not as fully as we should in a quantitative sense, but at least we recognize the substance of the problem. The poverty program is one attempt. This is designed in part to meet and take care of residual poverty. It's designed also to take into account and to respond to the poverty, the new poverty, which has arisen in the cities of our land. And this, in some respects, is, I think, the most serious poverty area. Since it is a fact now that in some of the great cities, people in the same family have been on relief through as many as 3 generations. We're on the verge, at least in those areas, of coming to recognize a kind of institutionalized poverty. President Johnson, in presenting the poverty program, not in quite these same words, but certainly expressing this same idea, said that we could not let this happen, and that the real thrust of the effort against poverty in the cities was going to be to break up this kind of institutionalization of poverty. And the third area which is recognized in this effort, of course, is rural poverty, which has been much neglected through the years. This a kind of patchwork, I suppose you could say, a kind of repair job, a making up for deficiencies and failures. At the same time, we've recognized the nature of the problem of transition in a more positive way. And this is manifest primarily, I think, in what we have done and the attention which was given to education in this Congress. This is the title of my talk to you. I think I perhaps have dwelt too long on other aspects of government action in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, but I think that all of them are related really to the effort which we make in the field of education. This Congress has also been called the Education Congress. And a number of commentators have said that we have done more in the field of education than any Congress in the history of the country. Now, I think this could be argued. I suppose the Congress that contributed most was probably the one that passed the Land-Grant College Act back in 1862. But I don't think we can give them full credit because I doubt whether they knew really what they were doing, or at least that they had a measure, had a means of measuring the significance of that action 100 years ago. And I suppose the Congress that passed the GI Bill of Rights should deserve a great deal of credit, too, for the contribution which they made to improved education and to the advancement of professionalism in America. But in any case, this Congress did act in every major area of responsibility, at least in those areas where action and response was most needed. We passed the higher education program so that those with great talents and with great gifts who might not otherwise be educated, and those who with limited talents who were attending colleges or seeking to attend colleges and universities might be better educated. We passed a program of education to assist medical schools and education in medicine. We passed and improved the program of education regarding vocational training. This to take care of the problems of automation and this whole transition which is taking place in our technology. And along with that, we passed a program to assist the states in the care and in the education of retarded children, mental retardation. A program which reached from those who had the greatest gifts and the highest talents on down through this middle area of people who provide service and technology to our society, and then a reaching down with a helping hand to those who are least gifted and most handicapped in our society, the retarded children. Well, you might say, what is the function and what is the role of the federal government or of government at any level, for that matter, in education and in the assistance of parents and guardians, or just in the assistance of those who seek to educate themselves? Now, I think you can make the case rather clearly. The function of government is negative, and it is also positive. There are those who argue that government has only a control function, that it's a kind of a regulatory body, that it ought to keep the peace, and sometimes it ought to wage wars, but that it has no positive role and no positive responsibility. To some extent, these two views of government are involved in the campaign of this fall, although there's a middle ground in which there's some overlapping and certainly some measure of confusion. But government does have a positive responsibility to promote the general good. And the general good of people falls into three categories: their material or physical good, their intellectual good, and their moral good. Now, government, of course, is limited in its power and in its competence to those things which might be defined as the temporal or the human good of society. But each of these three can well be contained within that limit and at the same time lay out for us a rather broad area of responsibility. To promote the general economic good of society is a responsibility which has been recognized in this country since the government was founded. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, accepted this responsibility. And the Constitution really defines, at least points out, the obligation in this area. But he made recommendations with regard to taxation and with regard to the handling of the public debt and with regard to the banking system of this country and a number of other areas which touch directly upon the operation of the American economy. And this responsibility to promote the economic growth of the country is a responsibility which has been accepted by government throughout the history of the country. The problem is not one that is to be argued on principle, but rather one in which the argument should relate to methods and means and measurement and so on. Question of which proposal is the more acceptable, which proposal offers the best possibility of bringing about improvement, if not a solution to problems. We move from this level of the material well-being to matter of the intellect and the training of the mind and of the spirit. The role of government must be more carefully circumscribed, of course. But nonetheless, there is a positive responsibility. And this responsibility was accepted very early at the level of local government in our country through public support for education. And as educational demands increase and as inequities develop within a country, then the responsibility for the support and for the assistance to education becomes a broader and broader responsibility. And we've had this movement from local responsibility to county responsibility to state responsibility, and at the present time, within the period particularly since the end of World War II, although we have had aid to education in rather general terms, really from back in 1787, even before the Constitution was adopted. In any case, an acceptance of broader responsibility for several reasons. One, because in many cases the local resources are not adequate to provide education, but also because we've come to recognize that those who are educated make a great contribution to the whole community. And since this is the case, the community itself, the state or the nation, has a stake in seeing to it that no talents and no abilities are wasted, but that all of these are developed for the perfection of the individual, and also for the general service of the community. So on this theoretical basis, we have proceeded, and I think that the program of federal assistance to education is a wholly defensible one and a most constructive one, and one which will contribute in great measure to the general good and to the advancement of our society. This, the general record, then, of this Congress on the great issues of civil rights and of the Test Ban Treaty and the handling of our economy and uncompleted work, and in the supplemental effort to educate and to care for all of the needs of the people of this country, not in an absolute way and not in the sense of governments taking full responsibility, but at least to lay a base and to meet the fundamental needs and to establish conditions and circumstances and a base upon which individuals and other organizations in our societies, churches and educational groups and business organizations which assume responsibility, all of these can work together or work separately in the building of what political leaders have been calling the good and the great society of America. It has been said that, and I think with some truth, that not just government problems, but that all of the problems which we face in the second half of the 20th century are different in a somewhat fundamental way from earlier problems. I would not say that they're different in a qualitative way. Following the launching of the first space satellite and some of the great advances in nuclear physics, there was a rash of commentary on the part of some politicians, but in most cases philosophers and historians, that we had now entered into a new period in history in which we had to consider our problems as differing not just in a quantitative way, but in a qualitative way from earlier problems. There were those who said we now needed a new philosophy and new theology and new economic and new political and new social thought and institutions. Well, certainly this is an overstatement, but any great advance, even in the knowledge of the physical universe, whether it be in outer space or whether it be in the knowledge of the secrets of nature in the nucleus and beyond, does call for a re-examination of those things in which we have believed, to look to our theology to see whether there is in it some fault and some inadequacy, certainly to look to our philosophy to see whether we have had half-truths which we have accepted and have found very useful, whether our economic and political and social institutions are any longer adequate to a new and changed circumstances. But certainly an advance of this kind does not call for the kind of total rejection and repudiation or revision which some observers did call for. We need to recognize two things, I think, and these are, in a sense, quantitative. The first is that the volume or the mass of current or contemporary history, those things which are a part of our life today, which we cannot put aside, which we cannot say are not involved in our lives, that this mass or volume is greater than it's ever been before. In the field of politics, for example, there was a time when we could set aside whole continents and whole nations and whole peoples and say, well, Africa is a dark continent, and maybe in the year 2000, why, it will be a force. It was not more than 50 years ago that China was referred to generally as a sleeping dragon, and no one was particularly disturbed over China as a force in world politics. Same was true of Latin America, a kind of good neighbor to the south that no one took very seriously. But today all of these peoples and all of these nations and all of these areas are a part of our own current history, and they all demand some attention from us, and they demand some judgment from us, and they demand some commitment from us. Not in the same measure, not in the same degree in every case, but at least some attention, fundamental recognition that they are here and that what happens in those countries has significance for us. And the second change that's taken place is that the movement of history is at a more rapid rate than it's ever been before. Not just the movement of political history, but the movement of the advance in science and in knowledge and the changes in the structure of society. All of these are taking place at a more rapid rate. And so we're called upon under these circumstances first to recognize the facts, then to assert and to declare and to accept that the only way in which we can give direction to history and to the movement of all of these things is through the use of the one power which we have. It's sometimes inadequate, but it's the best we have available. The application of reasoned judgment in the hope that by so doing we can give some direction and some control to the movement of history as through the exercise and the application of reasoned judgment, we undertake to give some direction and some order to our own lives. This challenge which we face has been described as a total challenge. And certainly if we are to respond to it, our own response, our recognition of what we're called upon to do, of the measure of the challenge, of the measure of the problem, does call for a total and a complete and a most intense and dedicated response on the part of all of us. Thank you. Now, I think I can take the questions directly. If any of you have to leave, feel quite free to do so. In the United States Senate, we're not accustomed to have very many people present when we begin a speech, and we're even less accustomed to have many left when we finish, so that I'll understand that you have something, and since I've made a case against attendance, why I'm not prepared in any way to be offended. They don't have to be related. I mean, any area of politics or any other field is open to you. Yes. Yeah. Question of age of Sukarno. I think there was a move in the House to exclude aid to Sukarno, and I don't know whether it was voted down in the House, but I think it was eliminated in the conference. This is the same sort of problem that we've had through the years with regard to aid, let us say, for Yugoslavia, for Tito. And you pass a kind of practical judgment as to whether or not it's best to go along with a person of that kind or with a government of that kind in the hope that it may straighten out, or whether